There is a name that almost every American knows: Anderson Cooper. Silver hair, calm voice, the man who has reported live from war zones, hurricanes, and the most consequential moments in recent history. He looks, on television, like someone who came from exactly the kind of steady, grounded background that produces serious journalists. He did not. He came from one of the most extraordinary family dynasties in American history, a world of inherited fortunes, social spectacle, and private devastation that would have broken most people before they ever found their footing. The story of how he got from there to here is not the one most people expect. The name behind the name. To understand Anderson Cooper, you have to first understand what the name Vanderbilt actually meant in America, and what it still carried, even by the time he was born. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original patriarch, built his fortune in the 19th century through steamships and railroads. By the time of his death in 1877, he was the wealthiest man in the United States, wealthier, in relative terms, than almost any individual in American history before or since. The fortune he left behind was staggering, roughly $100 million at the time, which translates to something in the range of several $billion in modern terms. The Vanderbilt name became, almost immediately, synonymous with a particular vision of American aristocracy. The family built mansions along Fifth Avenue in New York and summer cottages — the word is almost absurd given the scale — in Newport, Rhode Island. They gave lavish balls that defined the social season. They collected art, funded institutions, and moved through the world with the absolute assurance of people who had never needed to worry about anything ordinary. And then, with remarkable speed and consistency across generations, they spent it. By the 1970s, the Vanderbilt fortune had been divided, subdivided, dispersed, and depleted across multiple generations of heirs. The mansions had been sold off, converted into museums, or demolished. The family name still carried enormous social weight. It opened doors, commanded attention, placed you immediately in a particular context. But the actual financial reality behind it had become something much more complicated. Anderson Hayes Cooper was born on June 3, 1967, in New York City. His mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, heiress, artist, fashion designer, and arguably the most famous member of the family in the 20th century. His father was Wyatt Cooper, a writer and screenwriter from Mississippi, who had married Gloria in 1963. He was the second of their two sons. His older brother, Carter, was born in 1965. From the outside, the Cooper household looked like the continuation of a grand American story. Wealth, culture, creativity, a family anchored by two parents with genuine accomplishments of their own. From the inside, it was something considerably more complicated, and the complications began long before Anderson was old enough to understand any of them. The particular world Anderson was born into, Manhattan in the late 1960s, the social circles that revolved around the arts, around publishing, around the kind of cultural prominence that the Vanderbilt name still conferred, was one that placed enormous weight on appearance, on legacy, on being seen as the continuation of something important. That weight was invisible but constant. It shaped the way people in that world talked about themselves and each other, the way ambition was expressed or suppressed, the way vulnerability was managed. For a child growing up inside it, the experience was one of being surrounded by significance, without always understanding where it came from or what it required of you. The Vanderbilt name was always there, in the way people responded to his mother, in the photographs on the walls, in the stories that circulated about the family's history. What exactly it meant, and what it would eventually demand, was something Anderson would spend years working out. What comes next in his childhood is the part of the story that the Vanderbilt mythology leaves out entirely. And it is the part that explains almost everything about the man he became. Gloria, the original story. To understand what Anderson Cooper grew up inside, you need to spend some time with his mother's story, because Gloria Vanderbilt's life was, before Anderson was even born, already one of the most extraordinary and painful American stories of the 20th century. Gloria was born in 1924. Her father, Reginald Vanderbilt, was the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and a man whose relationship with the family fortune was, to put it gently, enthusiastic. He spent money at a rate that alarmed even people accustomed to Vanderbilt spending, and he died in 1925, when Gloria was less than 2 years old, leaving behind debts that substantially complicated whatever inheritance his daughter might have expected. Her mother, also named Gloria, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was young, beautiful, and entirely unprepared for the responsibilities of single parenthood. She left her daughter largely in the care of nurses and relatives while she pursued her own social life in Europe and New York. What happened next became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in American history. In 1934, when Gloria was 10 years old, her paternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, initiated a custody battle to remove Gloria from her mother's care. The trial was covered obsessively by the press. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Newspapers ran daily accounts of the testimony, which included allegations about the mother's behavior, her social habits, her fitness as a parent. A 10-year-old girl sat at the center of all of it, her private life examined in public by strangers, her future decided by a courtroom rather than by anyone who actually knew her. Gertrude Whitney, 1. Gloria was placed in her aunt's care and grew up at the Whitney estate in Old Westbury, Long Island. Her mother was granted limited visitation rights, but effectively removed from her daughter's daily life. The press had a name for Gloria during this period. She was called the poor little rich girl. The phrase stuck. It followed her for decades, through multiple marriages, through her career as an artist and designer, through the public and private dramas of her adult life. She wore it, eventually, with a kind of wry acceptance, but it never entirely stopped stinging. By the time Anderson was born in 1967, Gloria had already been married 3 times, to Pat DiCicco, to the conductor Leopold Stokowski, and to the director Sidney Lumet, before finding what appeared to be genuine stability with Wyatt Cooper. She was 43 years old. She had survived enough by that point to furnish several lifetimes of difficulty. Growing up as Gloria Vanderbilt's son meant growing up inside a particular kind of visibility. The family appeared in the press regularly. Gloria was a public figure, not simply by inheritance, but by her own active career in fashion, art, and design. The Vanderbilt name on her line of jeans in the late 1970s made her, briefly, one of the most commercially prominent names in American fashion. But it also meant growing up with a mother whose own childhood had been defined by abandonment, public scrutiny, and the particular wound of having been fought over by adults as though she were a possession rather than a person. That history shaped Gloria in ways that inevitably shaped her sons, whether anyone talked about it directly or not. What happened to the Cooper family in 1978 set the course of Anderson's life in ways he has spent decades trying to articulate. And what it did to him is something that cannot be understood quickly. Wyatt Cooper was, by most accounts, an exceptional man. He was born in Quitman, Mississippi in 1927, the son of a farming family with no particular connection to wealth or social prominence. He worked his way into the world of New York letters through talent and persistence, as an actor, a writer, a screenwriter. He was thoughtful, warm, and by all indications a genuinely devoted father. He was also, throughout the 1970s, in declining health. Wyatt Cooper suffered from heart disease, and by the mid-1970s, his condition had become serious enough that major surgery was considered necessary. In January 1978, he underwent open-heart surgery in New York. He did not survive it. Wyatt Cooper died on January 5, 1978, at the age of 50. Anderson was 10 years old. The loss of a parent at that age is shattering under any circumstances. But the particular circumstances here, the surgical setting, the sudden finality, the fact that his father had gone into an operating room and simply not come back, left a mark on Anderson that he has returned to, in interviews and in writing, throughout his adult life. He has described the period after his father's death as one in which he felt, profoundly and persistently, that the world was not a safe place, that the people you loved could disappear without warning. That security was something that could be taken away at any moment, regardless of what you did or how carefully you tried to hold on to it. Gloria was left at 53 with 2 young sons, a complicated fortune, and her own history of loss and survival to draw on. She managed, she continued her career. She was present, by all accounts, in the ways that mattered most. But the household after Wyatt's death was a different household, quieter in certain ways, more fragile in others. Anderson has said that he began, around this time, to think about death in a way that most 10-year-olds do not. He read about it. He thought about it. He did not talk about it much, because there was no easy language for what he was processing, and because talking about it seemed, in some way, to risk making it more real. What he also began to do, around this time, was watch the news. It sounds like a small thing, but for Anderson Cooper, it became the door through which he eventually walked out of one world and into another entirely. The television screen, with its images of events happening far away, offered something that his immediate world could not always provide. A sense that the world was larger than any single loss, that there were stories being told constantly, that the present moment was always part of something bigger. He was 10 years old, newly fatherless, and quietly beginning to understand what he wanted to do with his life. But before he could get there, something else would happen. Something so devastating that it would reshape everything he thought he knew about grief, about family, and about the limits of what a person can survive. Carter Cooper was Anderson's older brother by 2 years. By the accounts of people who knew him, he was a sensitive, creative young man. Someone who struggled, as many young people do, to find his footing in a world that had placed enormous expectations around his name and his family. The 1980s were difficult years for Carter. He was dealing with emotional struggles that, in retrospect, those closest to him recognized as serious, but that, at the time, were not fully understood or adequately addressed. This was not unusual for the era. The language and the resources available for understanding mental health in the 1980s were considerably more limited than they are today. On July 22, 1988, Carter Cooper fell from the 14th floor terrace of the family's New York apartment. He was 23 years old. Gloria was present. Anderson was not. Carter's death was ruled as a result of his own actions, connected to the emotional struggles he had been experiencing. He did not survive. Anderson was 20 years old. He was, at that point, a student at Yale University, studying political science, already beginning to think seriously about journalism and the world beyond his family's orbit. The phone call that reached him that night ended one version of his life and began another. He has spoken about Carter's death with a care and a precision that comes from having thought about it for a very long time. He has said that it was, in some fundamental way, the event that made him into the person he eventually became. Not because grief is instructive in any simple sense, it is not, but because the experience of it, combined with the loss of his father a decade earlier, created in him a particular relationship with fragility and impermanence that he has carried into every room he has ever entered since. He has also said something that is perhaps harder to articulate, but that rings true to anyone who has experienced significant loss at a young age, that after Carter died, he felt, in a strange way, that he had nothing left to lose. Not in a reckless sense, in a freeing sense. The worst thing had already happened. The ground had already shifted completely beneath him. Whatever came next, he would face it. Gloria, for her part, was utterly devastated. She had survived her own parents' failures, multiple marriages, public scrutiny, and the loss of her husband. Carter's death was different. She described it, in the years that followed, as something from which she never fully recovered, a loss so total and so wrong that it simply could not be accommodated by the ordinary mechanisms of grief. She wrote about it. She painted about it. She kept Carter present in her life through the decades that followed in every way she could manage, and she leaned, increasingly, on the son she still had. What Anderson did in the years immediately after Carter's death is one of the most unexpected chapters of a life full of unexpected chapters. And it is the chapter that began to show, unmistakably, who he actually was beneath the Vanderbilt name, the man who went to find the story. In the early 1990s, Anderson Cooper did something that almost no one from his background would have done. He bought a fake press pass. He was in his mid-20s, recently graduated from Yale, trying to break into journalism at a time when the conventional path, college connections, internships at established outlets, a careful climb up the institutional ladder, felt too slow, too confined, and too disconnected from the world he actually wanted to understand. He could have traded on his name. The Vanderbilt-Cooper connection would have opened doors at almost any media organization in America. He chose not to do that, or at least not primarily. Instead, he fabricated press credentials, flew to Myanmar, then Burma, and began filming footage of the civil unrest there on his own, with a small consumer-grade camera. He brought the footage back and sold it to Channel One News, a news service that distributed content to schools. It was not a prestigious placement. It was not the kind of debut that gets written up in media columns. But it was real footage from a real conflict, and it got him in the door. What is striking about this period is not the audacity of the fake press pass, though that is striking enough, but what it says about how Anderson Cooper understood his own position. He knew that his name was an asset. He also knew, with a clarity that not everyone in his situation would have had, that his name was not the same thing as his work, and that building something real required the latter rather than the former. He spent the early 1990s doing exactly that. He went to Somalia during the famine and the conflict that followed the collapse of the Somali state, a crisis that was, at the time, receiving insufficient international attention relative to its scale. He went to Rwanda during the genocide in 1994, a catastrophe of such speed and scale that the international press was still scrambling to comprehend it while it was happening. He went to Vietnam, to Haiti, to Bosnia. The Rwanda assignment, in particular, left a mark. The genocide unfolded over approximately 100 days in the spring and summer of 1994, and the images that came out of it, the scale of the killing, the speed of it, the failure of the international community to intervene in any meaningful way, were among the most disturbing that a journalist of Cooper's generation would encounter. He was 26 years old. He was on the ground, with his camera, watching something that the formal language of news reporting struggled to contain. He has spoken about that period with the careful restraint of someone who understands that some experiences resist easy narration, that the attempt to summarize what you have seen can sometimes do a disservice to the reality of it. What he took from Rwanda, and from the other assignments of that early period, was a reporter's knowledge that the world does not organize itself into comprehensible narratives on its own. You have to go and look. You have to stay long enough to understand what you are actually seeing rather than what you expected to see when you arrived. He was not doing this from behind a desk. He was in the field, with a camera, often in genuinely dangerous situations, filing reports that reflected direct witness rather than second-hand account. His reporting during this period established him as someone serious, not the heir to a social dynasty playing at journalism, but a working correspondent who had earned his credentials the hard way, in the places where the hardest stories were unfolding. By 1995, he had joined ABC News as a correspondent, a position that reflected his growing reputation in the industry. By the early 2000s, he had moved to CNN, where the trajectory of his career would accelerate dramatically. But the question of who he was, not professionally, but personally, was one that he was still, in certain crucial respects, keeping carefully private: the private life and the public one. For most of his career at CNN, Anderson Cooper's personal life was a subject that he declined to discuss publicly. This was his choice, and it was a considered one. He has explained it in various ways over the years, all of which come down to essentially the same thing. He felt that his private life was his own, and that sharing it was something he would do on his own terms, when and if he chose to. He is gay. He came out publicly in 2012 in an email exchange with the journalist Andrew Sullivan that Sullivan published with Cooper's permission. He was 44 years old. The statement he made in that exchange was careful and personal. He said that he had always been comfortable with who he was, that the people close to him had always known, and that his long reluctance to make a public declaration had been rooted in a desire to maintain the separation between his professional role as a journalist, someone whose job required a degree of neutrality and whose presence on screen should not become the story, and his private identity. He also acknowledged something that resonated with many people who read it: that in keeping his private life private for so long, he had, perhaps inadvertently, contributed to a kind of silence on the subject that he no longer felt comfortable with. The world had changed. Younger people were navigating their own identities in a landscape that was more open than the one he had grown up in, and there was something that felt wrong about a prominent public figure continuing to sidestep the subject when others could not afford to. The response to his coming out was, by the standards of such announcements, remarkably calm. He was a well-known and well-respected figure. The people who admired his journalism continued to do so. The story was covered, discussed, and then largely absorbed into the broader picture of who he was. What is interesting, in retrospect, is how little it changed the public perception of Anderson Cooper. Not because sexuality is insignificant, but because the person he had already made himself into on screen was so thoroughly established that the additional information simply joined the existing picture rather than replacing it. He had spent 2 decades building a professional identity that was entirely his own, not inherited, not gifted by anyone, not dependent on the Vanderbilt name. By the time he came out, that identity was solid enough to absorb the announcement without any of the drama that might have surrounded it at an earlier point in his career. What had been much harder and much less publicly discussed was what was happening in his family's financial story during this same period. A story that would eventually become very public indeed. The fortune that wasn't there. One of the most persistent myths about Anderson Cooper is that he is a wealthy man by inheritance. that the Vanderbilt fortune, however diminished from its original scale, still provided him with a cushion of significant wealth. He has addressed this directly more than once, and the reality is considerably more complicated. Gloria Vanderbilt had, over the course of her life, made and spent her own money with the same thoroughness that had characterized the Vanderbilt family across generations. Her fashion business, the Gloria Vanderbilt jeans line in particular, had been enormously successful in the late 1970s and early 1980s, generating revenue that put her in a genuinely comfortable position. But the business had its peaks and its declines, and Gloria, who lived well and spent on the things she valued, had not accumulated the kind of preserved, invested wealth that the name might have suggested. Anderson has said, in multiple interviews, that his mother told him directly, when he was relatively young, that he should not expect to inherit significant money. Not as a warning or a rebuke, but as practical information. She had her own relationship with the Vanderbilt wealth myth. She understood, better than anyone, what the name suggested versus what the reality actually was. And she wanted her son to build his life on something real. He has said that this was, in some ways, a gift. That knowing he was not going to be cushioned by inherited wealth meant that he built his career with a seriousness and a drive that might have been easier to avoid if the option of simply waiting had been available to him. In 2019, Gloria Vanderbilt died. She was 95 years old. She had lived an extraordinary life, surviving a childhood that would have defeated most people, building a creative career on her own terms, enduring losses that would have broken many others, and remaining, to the end, a genuinely vivid and present person. Anderson was with her when she died. He spoke about her death publicly, with the same directness and emotional honesty that has characterized his most personal disclosures. He described the experience with a specificity that was clearly drawn from having sat with it, turned it over, and decided to share it rather than keep it. When the details of Gloria's estate became public, it confirmed what Anderson had been saying for years. The inheritance was not the vast sum that the Vanderbilt name might have implied. The estate, while not trivial, reflected a lifetime of spending rather than preserving. The fortune that Cornelius Vanderbilt had assembled in the 19th century had, after more than a century of being divided and diminished, arrived at its final heir in a form very different from its origin. Anderson Cooper is wealthy. He has earned, over a long and successful career at CNN, a substantial income. What he is wealthy from is work, his own, sustained over decades in the rooms where serious journalism happens. The Vanderbilt heir who made it on his own is not a contradiction. It is, when you know the full story, almost the only ending that makes sense: the anchor and the hurricane. If there is a single moment that defined Anderson Cooper's public profile, the moment that transformed him from a respected correspondent into something closer to a national figure, it is Hurricane Katrina. In late August 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall along the Gulf Coast. The storm itself was catastrophic. The response to it, or more precisely, the failure of response at multiple levels of government, was a story that unfolded in real time, visibly and devastatingly on television screens across America. Anderson Cooper was in New Orleans. He was on the ground, in the water, in the streets, reporting what he saw with a directness and an emotional presence that was different from the measured, neutrality-forward style that television news had largely settled into. There was a moment, widely seen, widely discussed, in which a United States senator appeared on CNN to speak about the relief efforts in a way that struck Cooper as disconnected from the reality he had spent days witnessing. He pushed back, firmly, clearly, without hostility, but without deference either. He said, on air, that what he was seeing in the streets of New Orleans did not match the characterization being offered, and that the people who had been left there deserved better than that characterization. It was not a performance of outrage. It was the response of someone who had spent years in places where people suffered and where the gap between official accounts and lived reality was the whole story. He knew that gap intimately. He had reported from it his entire career. The response to that moment was enormous. People who had been watching the Katrina coverage with a kind of helpless fury at what they were seeing found in Cooper's exchange something that articulated what they felt. He became, almost overnight, a different kind of figure than he had been before. Not simply a journalist, but someone in whom people placed a particular kind of trust. His ratings at CNN rose significantly. His profile expanded. He began hosting CNN's flagship evening program, Anderson Cooper 360 Degrees, with a prominence that reflected his new standing in the network's hierarchy. He was careful, in the years that followed, not to allow that moment to become a character he simply repeated. He continued to do the work, the field reporting, the interviews, the long-form investigations, that had built his reputation before Katrina. He understood, intuitively, that the trust he had earned was contingent on continuing to deserve it. He covered the aftermath of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. He was in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, one of the most destructive natural disasters in the history of the Western Hemisphere, reporting from a city where the infrastructure had collapsed and tens of thousands of people were trapped under rubble. He was in the field during the Arab Spring, in Egypt and in Libya, in places where the situation was volatile enough that the risks were not theoretical. In each of these situations, there was something consistent about how he operated, a willingness to stay close to the human story rather than retreating to the analytical distance that the anchor desk often invites. He talked to people. He listened to what they said. He gave their specific individual experiences room on air rather than flattening them into statistics or representative types. This quality, the closeness to the human detail, was not an accident. It was the product of his own history with loss, layered over years of practice in the field, and it is what separated him, in the view of many viewers, from the kind of journalism that processes events from a comfortable remove. What Katrina also did, in a quieter way, was confirm something about where Anderson Cooper's emotional life and his professional life intersected. The losses he had experienced, his father, his brother, the various forms of grief he had carried for decades, had given him a particular capacity for being present in the middle of other people's devastation without looking away. He did not need to perform empathy. He had simply accumulated enough of his own experience with loss that it informed how he showed up in every difficult room he entered, the son and the mother. The relationship between Anderson Cooper and Gloria Vanderbilt was, by all accounts, one of genuine closeness, but it was also complicated in the ways that relationships between parents and children who have been through significant trauma together are always complicated. They were, for long stretches of his adult life, each other's primary family. Carter was gone. Wyatt was gone. The extended Vanderbilt world was present, but distant in the ways that large family networks often are. What Anderson and Gloria had was each other, a mother and son who had survived the same losses from different angles and who had found a way to remain close across the decades and the distances. Gloria continued to work well into her old age. She painted, wrote, and remained a cultural presence. Someone whom younger people, discovering her through her son, often found surprising in the best possible way. She was sharp, funny, and completely unwilling to perform the kind of gentle, softened version of herself that old age sometimes invites. She also, in her final years, participated with Anderson in a project that she might not have agreed to at an earlier point. The documentary, Nothing Left Unsaid. Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper, released in 2016. The film is exactly what its title suggests: a long, searching conversation between a mother and her son, covering the full span of Gloria's extraordinary life, touching on the custody battle, the marriages, Carter's death, the money, the name, all of it. Watching it is a strange experience, because what you are seeing is not a performance of family warmth, but the actual texture of a relationship that has been formed under pressure. They talk to each other the way people talk when they have run out of things to protect each other from. Directly, sometimes with difficulty, with a kind of love that has been tested enough times that it no longer needs to announce itself. Anderson has said that making the documentary was partly motivated by his awareness that Gloria was getting older, and that there were things he wanted to ask and things she was willing to say that might not be available forever. He asked. She answered. The result was a record of a particular kind of American life that will not exist again. When Gloria died in June 2019, Anderson announced it on air. He read a tribute to her that he had written himself, describing who she was and what she had meant to him. He was emotional. He was also characteristically precise, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that language is the tool you reach for when the thing you are trying to express is almost too large for any of them. He has a son of his own now. Wyatt Morgan Cooper was born in April 2020 via surrogate, and the name, unmistakably, is both a tribute to his father and a form of continuity that carries the Cooper thread forward into a generation that will never meet Wyatt the Elder, but will grow up carrying his name. A second son, Sebastian Luke Mizani Cooper, was born in February 2022. Both boys carry with them, in their names and in their father's life, the weight and the warmth of everything that came before, what the name carries now. There is something worth sitting with at the end of this story about what it means to come from a name like Vanderbilt in the 21st century. The name still exists in the world. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, endowed by Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1873, carries it forward in the most visible institutional sense. The Breakers, the Newport Mansion, is a museum. The Fifth Avenue mansions are gone, demolished long ago to make way for buildings that now seem themselves like artifacts of another era. The Fortune, as a coherent entity, does not exist. What exists is the story, and the story, in its full form, is not simply the one about railroad barons and Newport balls and the gilded excess of the 19th century's most conspicuous wealth. It is also the story of a little girl in a courtroom in 1934, of a man dying on an operating table in 1978, of a young man lost on a terrace in 1988, of a son in a hospital room in 2019 saying goodbye to his mother. Anderson Cooper did not escape the Vanderbilt name. He carried it through grief and war zones and hurricane-flooded streets and long on-air conversations and documentary films and the particular kind of journalism that requires you to be present in the worst moments of other people's lives. He carried it into newsrooms and into the field and into a private life that he built on his own terms, slowly and carefully, over decades. What he made of it, the career, the life, the family he has now, is something that no amount of inherited wealth could have produced. It required the other thing, the losses, the drive, the refusal to simply coast on a name, the decision to go to Myanmar with a fake press pass and find out whether he had anything real to offer the world. He did. The world found out. And the story that began in the shadow of one of the greatest fortunes ever accumulated in America arrived, eventually, at a man who earned what he has, piece by piece, in the places where the light and the camera were pointed at things that mattered. The Vanderbilt heir who became his own person did so the only way that actually works, by deciding, early and consistently, that the name was the beginning of the story, not the whole of it. That is a choice. Not everyone in his position has made it. He did, and the life it produced is, in its own way, more interesting than the one the name alone might have guaranteed. It is also, perhaps, more durable, built on work and experience, rather than on the kind of inherited position that can be taken away when the money runs out or the social world shifts. What Anderson Cooper built, nobody can repossess. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.